civil affairs, respectively, for the Times. On my return to civilian life, I decided, with the brash innocence of the young, to become a war correspondent. Having heard Edward Hulton, the proprietor of the magazine Picture Post, lecture at my school, I wrote to him, applying for such a job. He was, at that time, about to launch a new weekly current affairs magazine, The Leader, its title that of a defunct magazine which had to accompany its purchase for the use of its paper allowance. Its new editor, Charles Fenby, needed a junior editorial assistant, one cut above an office boy, and I was given the job at 5 guineas a week. Fenby was a kindly man, and when I was invited to visit Calais for a weekend by the British town major, whose daughter was a friend of mine, he agreed to sign a letter applying for the pass necessary to visit France. This was assumed by the War Office to be an application for a war correspondent's license, and I was thereupon granted one. I did not return from the continent for a week. Having hitchhiked to Brussels and beyond, and on my return to London, my editor was astonished to see his truant youth wearing battle dress and a war correspondent's insignia. He seemed more amused than angry, and, to my amazement, announced that, having visited the continent for my own ends, I should continue to do so for the magazine. So, for the last 3 months of the war in Europe, I saw something of it with the Army and the Royal Navy, although, as it will become apparent, the lowliness of my status meant that I trailed far in the wake of the correspondence I sought to emulate. Tom Pocock, Chelsea, 1983. Chapter 1. At breakfast in Miss Jolly's lodging-house, the mood and conversation were dictated by the number and proximity of explosions during the preceding night and the morning's news of the war. Miss Jolly herself was far too busy in the steam of her tiny, subterranean kitchen to bother with a radio, as she would constantly point out, so the news would be brought down to the basement parlour by Mr. Harthen, the probation officer, or Mr. Smith, the commercial artist. We, the other lodgers at 54 Oakley Street, would have heard the muffled voice of the newsreader through the walls of the tall Victorian house in Chelsea, and had become adept at assessing its tone. At Christmas there had been sombre, measured speech announcing the unexpected German offensive in the Ardennes and its eruption across Belgium towards Antwerp. Now the tones were more confident, as the enemy was contained and counterattacks launched, as was only to be expected by us once Field Marshal Montgomery was taking a direct part. Almost every morning, a brisk voice would tell us that Bomber Command had been out in force again last night. Then there would be a pause before the slow, solemn report of the number of aircraft missing. If this were more than about 30, with more than 200 young men lost, we would tend to eat our scrambled egg powder and toast silently before departing for work. On this Wednesday morning, the 3rd of January 1945, the news had been good and our mood cheerful. The Americans had relieved the beleaguered garrison of Bastogne, and there was an interview with its commander, Brigadier McAuliffe, who had rebuffed the German demand to surrender with the cheeky, and we felt slightly vulgar reply, "Nuts." The number of aircraft lost by the Luftwaffe in their attacks on Allied airfields on the first day of the year was given as 364, a claim we thought exaggerated and years later found had been wildly so. The Russians had reached Budapest. So this morning there was an exchange of banter with Miss Jolly and her sister Nora. They were tiny women in late middle age, just too genteel to be considered cockneys, although Miss Jolly had, from long hours in the kitchen and toiling up and down the 7 flights of stairs to make beds and occasionally dust the rooms, the pale, strained, sinewy look of a working-class Londoner. Her younger sister, on the other hand, had bright eyes and round, rosy cheeks beneath her grey fringe of hair, because it was she who, with an enormous wicker